Hey folks, welcome back to Mark Kelly Farm. It's that time again, Christmas time. We need to make our yearly Christmas gift, which means we need to head out in the shop. It's cold outside, but we'll get her done. Stick around. So we've got our yearly Christmas present to make. Every year our big family here in Nebraska draws names, and the men get men's names and the women get women's names. So every year I like to build a knife for my cousins, and I always got to make sure I draw a different one. So I only got 2 more to make, and we're going to make one this year. So we're going to start off, if you remember, went down to the hardware store and got me a lawn edger blade. Got the one with the big hole in the center because I use this hole and it's convenient to already have this hole in here. The reason I get this blade, because it's already hard material, I don't have to forge it, and it's not so hard that it's brittle and going to break, because these are designed to take a little bit of abuse because you're hitting concrete and other stuff with it. Unlike, say, a file or something like that we can make a knife out of that is really hard, and if you drop it on something hard, it'll sometimes break and shatter. So that's why we like starting off with one of these. So we're going to get our design drawn on here, and we'll start getting this thing cut out. All right, we've got our 2 pieces cut apart. So now we can work on nipping these corners off. And then once we get that done, we can round some stuff off with our belt sander. We got our rough profile out, so we'll square up our belt sander here, and then we can put this baby here on the belt sander and get all of our corners right. Got everything trued up here on the belt sander. Everything's kind of taking its shape. You can see this was our blade before. Just like that. And those were 2 knives out of that blade. That's what they look like. They feel real good in the hand. Real good fit, even with my big hands. They feel really good. In fact, this one feels better than this one. I think this one's got a little more of a curve right here. But we can put a little more curve right here and make that one feel the same way. So now we need to sand the face of these. What we did here on the belt sander, if you saw, we trued up, we squared the belt with the table. Because when they stamp these blades out, these edges aren't always perfectly square with the rest of it. So you need to go around and sand around the outside until you don't have any of the black left. And that squares it up with the rest of the blade. Now we still have to get into this area here, and I'll show you a little trick how to do that. All right, get you a small dowel of wood like this, and then take it over onto your bandsaw. Cut a slot in the end. I don't know if you can see that slot. And then we're going to take a piece of sandpaper, slip into this end a little strip, and we'll show you how to use it. Take your dowel, put a piece of sandpaper in it, and then we've got it run below the top of our vise. And our vise is 90 degrees with the drill press. So as we take this in here to sand that area will stay 90 degrees as we sand it. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to take this powder coating off of here. And we're just going to do it with our belt sander. We have our heavy duty magnet in here in the device. We just stuck the knife to it. And then we'll get the belt sander and hit it flat. Now you see how it's taking it off the outside edges but not in the middle. That means our piece isn't exactly true, but we'll keep sanding it until all of that comes out. Now this area here isn't quite as important as the blade because this is going to be covered up with our scales. So we don't have to get too crazy about that. But this does need to go all the way down to where all of that powder coat comes off. You also want to be mindful too, you don't want to heat this blade up too much. We're doing fine right now. But if we get too terribly hot, we could lose some more hardness out of this metal. So every now and then you want to touch it and check it. Make sure you're not overheating the steel. Got this side done. We'll pull this off, let it cool a little bit. We'll throw the other one in here, do one side of it, then we'll flip them both over, do it again, and then we'll progressively hit it with a finer grit to get all of our scratches out. And then we'll get her shined up, and then we can start refining a little bit more, start drilling our holes, and getting more done on these. We have the powder coat off of both blades, so now we just need to go down in our grit size, actually up, I guess. We were using 80 grit, so we'll go to 120, 220, 320, and so on. We've gone all the way through 120 grit with our belt sander, and that's the highest grit that we have for the belt sander. So now we're going to start hand sanding. So we put a guide coat on the blade. This is just red felt tip pen is all this is. So now when we go with the 220 grit on the sanding pad, once all the red is gone, we know that all the scratches from the 120 grit are gone. It's called a guide coat. So it just gives you a guide. So once the red's gone, you know you're done with this grit. Now we're starting to 320 grit. All right, now we got 400 grit. Do our first pass with that. .600 grit. Just got done with the 600 grit, and I think that's about as far as we're going to take it. I found if you make them too crazy, people get afraid to use them, and we don't want that. This is plenty shiny enough. We could obviously go crazy, go 800, 1200, 2000, and just make this thing a mirror. But like I said, This is about as far as we need to go. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to go over to the drill press and drill our pinholes. And then we'll drill a couple extra holes in the middle for just gripping, so the epoxy has something a little more to grip to. The epoxy will just kind of squeeze into those extra holes, and it'll help hold everything together because it won't allow it to move around. Not that the pins would let it move around anyway. But we're going to go with 2 pins in each one of these. And I have some special drill bits to drill the hardened material. Got our holes drilled. If you wonder how we knew where to drill them, I marked where about the edge of our scale would be, and then I just came 3/4 of an inch in from each end, and then I just eyeballed these little bit bigger holes. So the next thing we're going to work on is start putting an edge, grinding the bevel on these blades. We've got a new 120 grit belt on our belt sander. I've got my sharpening jig, homemade sharpening jig, and we've got it clamped down to our table. So what this allows us to do, we'll take the tape off of the knife, of course. It allows us to hold the knife flat along this surface and then run it along that belt like that. And that gives us, because we're up here on the rounded part of the belt, it gives us kind of a hollow grind. So there's an example right there. That's one pass. But it's going to take many more passes, but you can see how that keeps a nice straight edge on the blade. Now when you run your blade on here, you want to keep your blade at right angle with the sanding belt. So as you sand, you're going to be turning your blade like this. You don't want to come in and do this. So always be square with the belt as you move it through. The other thing I do is I flop from side to side with each pass. For one, that kind of keeps me the same on both sides, even though at the end we'll take a look down the edge of the blade, and that'll tell you whether you're in the middle and you can hit one side more or the other. What this also does, by turning each time, the grit on this wheel or on this belt is going to get finer and finer as we go along, as the grit comes off. So this edge will get finer and finer as we go. There'll be a less grainy look to it, and it won't take so long to grind the other side because all the grit's gone. We'll be pretty much done when the grits come off of this, and the edge it'll look the same on both sides. Now the other thing we do as we're grinding is we keep our fingers, bare fingers on the blade like this. One, you should never use power tools with gloves because it'll suck your fingers into the power tool. But what this also does is it lets us keep track of the heat in the blade. If the blade gets so hot that we can't keep our fingers on it, we dunk it in the water here to cool it off, because we don't want to lose our hardness in our blade. And we don't, especially out here on the tip, it takes very little time for this tip to overheat because it's so small out here. And if that turns blue or a different color, you're losing your hardness in your blade. You don't want this thing to turn colors. So we'll keep going and we'll come back when we're done. You can see even with the tape on here, we get superficial little scratches just from moving on here. So once we get all done with this, we'll have to touch up this blade with some fine sandpaper. We'll hit it with the 600 grit again to clean it back up before we start working on the scales. There you go. She's all done and sharp as a razor. So you can see as that sanding belt got finer, there's less sanding marks on the blade itself. Sorry, it's not focusing well. but we lost a lot of the grit off of this belt. You can't hardly feel the grit anymore, and that makes for a real nice blade, and that's why we go back and forth. But you can look down the knife, it's even on both sides, front and back. So we just got to touch up those little scratches that we have in there, and then we'll start working on the scale. Before I do that though, I'm going to sharpen this other knife, put the edge on that. We'll put a new belt on here, and we'll do the same thing to that one. All right, we got a good fire in the shop stove. We got our shop coffee going on up there. And we've looked through our wood. We got some ironwood, some honey locust, some pecan. We got some black walnut. We got quite a few different species of wood. I've decided to use manzanita. The biggest reason is the person that's getting this knife, this manzanita is off his uncle's ranch out in the Sierras in California. And manzanita is a brush that grows in the wild there, and this is what it looks like. This is a fairly big specimen. Usually they don't get this big. This is a pretty old manzanita. You can see the wood there. When the manzanita is live, this bark is actually red, but this is fairly well dried out. You can still see a little red in that. But we've already cut some pieces in this prior. The last piece of this that I cut out, I just slabbed it, and I have a few slabs. But it's got a little character to it, and I love the color. So we're going to use this piece, and this is big enough for both scales on one of these knives. Now, we're going to go down to working on one knife now, because one of these is going to have some scales on it that I'm not ready to do yet. We're going to try making some micarta out of some stabilized pine cone, and we'll show you that process one day when we do it. But we'll take one of these knives now, and we'll just continue on with it, and we'll start cutting some scales out. Now, before we get too crazy, we're going to put some painter's tape over our blades so we don't get any scratches that we can't get out later. And then you can see before we get too close with our pattern, we're going to drill our 2 pinholes. We'll drill one hole, put a pin in it, and then we'll drill the other hole, put a pin in it, and then we'll know exactly where that's going to sit on that wood. And then we can come up here to the belt sander and take us down a lot closer. Now this end of the knife is going to just do a nice curve right here to match this curve, and then we'll do that later. Once we have both pieces drilled, we can pin them together and then cut the front of this and actually finish it, because later on it's going to be too hard to finish when it's on the knife. The rest of the handle we can finish once we get it glued up. Now that we have our 2 holes in this piece, we'll keep one of the pins in, and then we're going to index this other hole with the drill bit. All right, we're in there. So we're lined up with both holes right now. We'll bring this down on the other piece of wood. So we'll make sure that we've got enough room and everything's lined up. We'll hold this down like this, And we'll turn this puppy on. Alright, we're all the way through. We'll put our other pin in here all the way through both pieces, and then we'll index this hole through the drill bit like we did on this one, and then we'll drill this one all the way through. Got both scales indexed all the way through with both pins. So now what we're going to do is we're going to pull these pins, but before we do that, we'll make a reference mark across both sides of this. So when we go to put the pins back through the wood, because we're going to pull the knife out, put the wood together, and put the pins just through the wood, we'll know which side of the scale goes together. And then we can start getting a final cut on the front here. We can true up kind of the rest of it a little bit, get it back down to where it's more manageable. And then once we finish the front of this, we can glue this thing together and then do the final finish after the epoxy has set. So we got the front edge rounded here on the belt sander. So now we're going to take some sandpaper and finish this by hand. We'll start off with probably 180 grit to get the little lines out of it. And then we'll go to 220 and then probably 320, and that'll be all we need on the wood. All right, folks, we are in the house now because we have got our front of our scales all nice and rounded off and sanded to 320. So it's pretty much a finish sanding on there. So we're going to take these apart. We have our pins. We have a pair of pliers to manipulate our pins. We have a little cup to put some denatured alcohol in because we'll need this not only to clean the surfaces before we do the epoxy. We have some Q-tips here that we use on the front of right along the blade to get that epoxy off of the blade. We're also going to use painter's tape along the back edge of that blade to keep the epoxy off of the blade. We have our denatured alcohol like we talked about. We've got our knife that we're going to tape up a little better now that we've got ready to go. We've got a couple small C-clamps that we're going to use for the pressure when we get this thing together. And we have our epoxy that we brought into the house yesterday because this was out in the shop and it was super cold out there and this stuff would not run. We brought it into the house because we knew we were going to use it in the house. This is a 2-part 5-minute epoxy. You put equal parts of this together, mix it up, and then it will harden in around 5 minutes or so. Sometimes you have just a little bit longer, like in the cold weather we have right now. It won't harden near as fast. And that's also why we're in the house, because if we were to do this out in the shop, this just wouldn't harden because it's too cold. So we're going to get going here and we'll bring you back once we start putting it together. So what we've done, we put our pins in, we added some tape to the blade here, and then we very gingerly with a razor blade, we cut right around the front of the scales. So now this blade is protected all the way around. If we get a little epoxy, it's not going to get onto the blade and cause too big of a problem. And then we'll do the same thing to this side here. We'll put the other scale on and then we'll score that and then pull that little piece off. So we've got our tape on both sides where it needs to be. We've also taken our scales and marked an X on the inside that goes towards the knife so we don't get these mixed up when we go to put them on. I've done that before, and then you got to start all over again with these. So we've got X's on there. So now we're going to take our denatured alcohol. We're going to clean the surface of the knife and the gluing surface of the scale. Then we'll let that dry. That's going to take away any grease or oil or whatever that might be there that would inhibit the adhesion. And then we'll start putting this together. So I'm going to show you right now, because once I get going, I'm not going to be able to video. So what we'll do to start is we'll start our pins in one side of the scales, like this. And then we'll hold this, and I'm going to use a toothpick to apply the epoxy because it's nice and small. You don't need a lot of epoxy on here. So we'll skin this whole area with some epoxy, and then we'll apply the knife to it like this. And then we'll move the pins through a little further. We'll apply epoxy to this area here. We'll move the pins through, and then we'll place the other scale on, and then move the pins all the way through to where they're sticking through both sides. We're going to try extremely hard not to get any epoxy on the outside of the scales, because when we clamp, we don't want to epoxy our clamps to the wood. However, if we do get some epoxy on the outside, all is not lost. We can wipe a little bit of it off. We can put some painter's tape down on the wood and then apply the clamp. And then later on, this tape can peel off or can just be sanded off, because we're going to sand the whole outside anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But if it were to happen, that's our game plan. So we'll bring it back when this is glued up and show you what it looks like glued up. When I forgot to tell you, hear me now, believe me later, gloves when you're messing with epoxy. You don't want to get the stuff on your fingers. The good thing about the gloves, if it gets on your fingers, you can just peel the gloves off and you're good to go. All right, folks, we've got it all glued together. We managed not to get any epoxy on the outside, which I think is a first. So we're just checking the top end of it here for any squeeze out. We take the denatured alcohol, which kind of acts as a solvent, and take that off. We do it on both sides. We don't worry about what's squeezed out in between, because that's going to sand off with that wood, because we're going to sand the wood all the way down to that metal. So we don't have to worry about that. This front edge is the only thing that we need to worry about. So get a dry Q-tip, come around that front edge, cleaning any of that off, and then that alcohol will dry pretty quick. Now, if you do get some residual epoxy on there and it makes the wood dark, it doesn't matter, because we're going to finish this handle wood later, so it'll blend right in with that darkness area. So now that we've got all that taken care of, we'll put another heavy-duty squeeze clamp right here on the front. So this is going to sit this way for 24 hours. We're going to let this cure. Yes, it's supposed to set in 5 minutes, but for good handling purposes, we're going to let it sit till tomorrow. But you won't have to wait that long. See you in a little bit. Helpful hint during glue up. As you're putting things together, if one of your scales gets held up and gets in a bind, don't force it. I've seen many people force those scales and they snap or they break. Then your operation's over with and you have to clean all this mess up. Sometimes you got to sand all that epoxy off. It's a crazy mess. So save yourself a lot of heartache. If it does get hung up, just pull that one pin out just a little bit, move the scale down where it's supposed to be, and then run that pin back up in there with those pliers. Don't force the scale. All right, this is where we're at on the knife after glue up. We're going to head out to the shop real quick and knock a lot of the unnecessary material off. And it's 50 degrees minus wind chill out today, so we won't be out there very long, but I wanted to do this so I could start the leather work downstairs. So let's brave the cold and go out and do this real quick. Well, look at the breath out here. Crazy cold out here in the shop. First thing we did is I took a pair of snips and I cut what was left of the pins, and then I come over here on the belt sander and I flatten them out so I can get a flat profile here. And we've got a pretty aggressive belt on here. So we're going to take this wood down to the metal all the way around, and then we're going to thin this profile out. We're probably about 2/3 thicker than we need to be on these scales, so we're going to knock some of that off as well. All right, that's what it looks like when you get down to the metal. You know you're there because your sanding belt starts throwing sparks. When it's just grinding wood, it doesn't. So we've got down to the tang all the way around. So now we're going to work on the thickness. All right, it was getting ugly out in the shop. So we came in, we have our sides whittled down to about where they need to be. And everything looks good. Now this little knot area here on the end went a little deeper than I realized it was. It kind of went into the wood. And I thought it was just the surface where it would come out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to epoxy this in. We'll put some painter's tape here along the edge and back it up, and then we'll pour epoxy in that tonight and let that sit overnight, and it will fill that up, and then we can sand it down and it'll be stabilized and it'll look just fine. But that's what she looks like. All right, it's another day and we got the heater going because we don't want to freeze out here again today, because we'll be spending a little more time out here. So last night I put epoxy in our little knot hole here that we had, and then I put it under vacuum with our vacuum sealer canister. I threw it in there and suck all the air bubbles out. You can see where the air bubbles came to the surface. So once we sand that down, it should be clear, and then when we clear coat the handle, it should all match real nicely. That's what that knot looks like after sanding it flush. It's going to come out nice. All right, we sanded the face of this to get most of the heavier grit scratches out. We did both sides, and then we come through and we hold it at a 45-degree angle, and we come along here, and that's the only angle we do, and we watch this area between where we're sanding and the tang of the knife to try to make that equal all the way around as we're going around at a 45-degree angle. And now the rest of this will be hand sanding. You can see on the belt sander we've kind of transitioned some of this into the grain going the other direction. But as we get done hand sanding, that'll address all of this here. And then, of course, once we get close, we'll take the tape off, and we'll also do this area here, changing the direction of the grain, but that's going to be last. So we even sanded a little bit here on the corners just to round that. And with this tape on here, we're able to go around there without nicking or scratching the blade. But that's what we do. Now it's all about the hand sanding. Looking a lot better, right? Look at our little knot there. That's going to polish up real nicely. Now to do the initial rounding and stuff on here, we're using a 120 grit. And all we're wanting to do is take off those corners. And then we also get on here on the steel and make sure that our grain's going the right way. It doesn't take very much. And as we get finer on the grit, that metal will look a lot better. But just for the rough rounding, we're not getting real aggressive. We're just going around. And then here on the end, we'll just kind of sand kind of backwards like this, just rounding that bottom corner. And then once we lose that definite line, we'll change grits and we'll start polishing. We'll start out with a 220 obviously, and we'll go to 320. And when you're dealing with wood, 320 is pretty fine, and that's about as fine as you need to go. Before we change grits to start doing the finer work here on the scales, I took the tape off the back edge of the blade, and we're going to hit it with this 120 grit to change our direction of our grain back here, because we want to do it with the heavier grit in case we have any lines that are going to be a little bit harder to get out. All right, we've changed grit, and once you change grit, you want to go away from the flat block and start using your fingers, because with your fingers you can kind of round over the edges like this, and it makes for a much nicer look, because you can kind of round the sandpaper over. So we're on 220 now, looking beautiful. I know that's my favorite word to use. Sorry. But it is looking beautiful. You can see our finished scales after we've gone past the 320. Even shined up the pins. So this is going to look real nice with a finish on it. You can see the steel emblem still there. And we'll have to clean that all out with some denatured alcohol once we're done, because there's a little dirt down in there, but that's fine. So what we're going to do now is we're going to tape up the blade again right along here and the rest of it, and then we'll put a finish on this handle with scales that will seal that off. So here's the stuff I use. It's by Minwax spar urethane. So just a spray. You can see we got our blade all masked off. So I'll hold this in my left hand with a glove on, and I'll spray this, and I'll put a pretty good coat on it, because I try to get by with just one coat. If any area gets dull while it's drying, I'll just shoot it just a little spot back on it again. And then after I shoot it, I will sit there and I will continuously move this thing around. Keep spinning it around and around, so I avoid any drips that way or runs. And then once it sets, I'll go put it in something to hold it and just let it cure. All right, folks, there she is with the finish on the scales. Turned out beautiful. You can see our knot area there. Adds a nice little detail. So with the exception of just some finish little polishing and cleaning here, we're all done. So we're down here in the basement. We're going to do our leather work. We got our leather tools out. And I know I'm going to get yelled at if I don't show you the leather. I'm not going to show you the process, but I'll show you the finished product. And at the end of the video, we'll link our leather sheath making video so you can see the process. Got the leather work done. That's what she looks like. Made this as a neck knife. I'll show you how it wears. Right there, just like that. And you can adjust it by pulling or pushing on these knots. If you pull on this end, these knots get closer together and it hangs lower. You pull these knots apart, it hangs higher. But hope you enjoyed this project much as I did. Well, I think my cousin will enjoy that knife, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Apologize for it being so long, but there's a lot involved in this process, and I wanted you to see every part of it. So, till next time, stay safe, stay healthy. If you want to see the leather making video, it's right there. See you next time on Mark Kelly Farm.